The Gravemouth station clung to the edge of the Calypso Nebula like a rusted barnacle, a place where fortunes were made from the bones of dead ships and souls were lost in the silent, swirling dust. It was the last stop for the desperate and the first for the damned, a skeletal lattice of worn-out haulers, repurposed habitats, and flickering neon bars that promised oblivion in a bottle. Kalen had called it home for 3 years, a self-imposed exile from a life that had burned down around him. He'd traded the clean rooms of the Kepler Institute for the grease-stained reality of a salvage technician, swapping the elegant equations of xenophysics for the brute mechanics of plasma cutters and tractor beams. Here, no one knew of the Phoenix Project, of the recursive energy core that had sung to him in the language of collapsing stars before it tried to eat a moon. Here, he was just Cal, the quiet tech who was too good with sensors and who drank his synthale alone. The work was honest, mindless, and it kept the memories at bay most of the time. But the nebula was a fickle beast. It birthed stars with a furious, beautiful light, and it also held secrets in its dark, gaseous heart secrets that sometimes drifted out into the shipping lanes like messages in a bottle, warnings that went unheeded. That's what the Erebus was. It didn't appear on sensors with the clean signature of a distress beacon or the chaotic flare of a reactor breach. It simply coalesced. One moment, there was nothing but the usual cosmic background radiation. The next, a mass shadow so profound it was like a hole punched in space-time. It was dead silent, emitting no heat, no energy, no communication signals. It was a ghost, a ship-shaped void drifting on the solar winds, and it was the biggest thing anyone on the Gravemouth had ever seen. Captain Eva Rostova, a woman whose face was a roadmap of busted deals and narrow escapes, saw the score of a lifetime. Her voice, rough as asteroid gravel, crackled over the station's comms, pulling Kalen from the guts of a faulty atmospheric scrubber. "Cal, get your ass to the observation deck. Bring your best kit. We've hooked a Leviathan." On the deck, the command crew was already gathered, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of the main view screen. Yorick, the old salvage chief with a beard like frayed wire and knuckles scarred from 1,000 brawls, was muttering into a cup of steaming calf. Dr. Eris Thorne, the station's resident corporate liaison from Omnitech, stood apart, his tailored suit a stark anomaly in their world of worn-out coveralls. He watched the screen with an unnerving stillness, a predator's patience in his eyes. The Erebus filled the screen, an obscenity of silent, black metal. Its design was unlike anything Kalen had ever seen. The hull was a seamless, matte material that didn't reflect the nebula's light so much as swallow it. There were no visible thrusters, no weapon emplacements, no viewports, just smooth, flowing lines that converged into aggressive, unsettling angles. It felt less like a machine and more like the carapace of some deep space insect. But it wasn't the ship's appearance that made the blood freeze in Kalen's veins. It was the low-frequency pulse his advanced sensor suite was picking up, a rhythmic, almost biological thrum that was identical, impossibly, terrifyingly identical to the final readings of the Phoenix Project. "It's a recursive energy signature," Kalen whispered, his voice tight. Rostova turned to him, her eyes sharp. "English. Cal." He couldn't look away from the readings, from the familiar, sickening wave pattern that had haunted his nightmares. "It's a theoretical power source. It folds space-time in on itself to generate near-infinite energy. It's not supposed to exist. We tried to build one. Back at the Institute, it became unstable." Thorne stepped forward, his smile smooth and polished. Unstable is another word for groundbreaking. Kalen. Omnitech has been tracking whispers of such a vessel. A rogue design built in secret. Imagine the value of that core. Captain, enough to buy a planet, not just a station. Yorick snorted, his voice a low growl. And I've heard whispers, too. Thorn. Old spacers' tales of vessel eaters that drift out of the Calypso's heart. Ships that lure you in with silence and strip the meat from your bones. That thing ain't right. Rostovah's gaze was fixed on the potential payday. The number of zeros that could buy her a ticket out of this forgotten corner of the galaxy. We're going in, she declared, silencing all debate. Yorick, you, me, and a security team. Cal, you're coming. I need you to tell me if that core is going to blow up in our faces. Kalen felt a cold dread mix with a fatalistic, scientific curiosity. He wanted to run, to scream at them that they were fools, and that they were approaching the very thing that had cost him his career, his reputation, his peace. But a darker part of him, the part that still yearned to understand the beautiful, terrible song of the Phoenix Core, needed to see it. He needed to know if someone else had succeeded where he had failed, or if they had simply created a bigger monster. The boarding shuttle felt like a coffin as it crossed the void toward the silent ship. Up close, the Erebus was even more monolithic, its black hull absorbing the shuttle's running lights, making it feel as if they were sinking into an ocean of ink. The docking clamps latched on with a hollow thud that echoed through their small craft. There was no response, no automated greeting, no klaxon of alarm. They cut through the hull, the plasma torch hissing against the unknown alloy, and stepped inside. The air was frigid, sterile, and carried the scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like blood and batteries. The ship's interior was a nightmare of non-Euclidean geometry, corridors curved at impossible angles, seeming to stretch and contract with the pulsing thrum that was now a palpable vibration in the deck plates. Gravity felt inconsistent, shifting subtly with every step, creating a disorienting sense of vertigo. Rostova led the way, mag boots clamped to the floor, pulse rifle at the ready. Yorick followed, his hand resting on a heavy-duty bolt gun, his eyes scanning the alien architecture with deep suspicion. The two security officers, young and nervous, brought up the rear. Kalen, his sensor tablet clutched in his hand, felt like a nerve ending exposed to the air. The pulse was everywhere, a constant, low-level hum that seemed to bypass his ears and resonate directly in his skull. The tablet screen was a mess of illogical data-temporal fluctuations, impossible energy spikes, and a repeating fractal pattern that seemed to be learning and adapting to his scans. They found no crew, no bodies, not even a speck of dust. The ship was pristine, as if it had just rolled off the assembly line. Yet it felt ancient and profoundly wrong. As they moved deeper, one of the security officers, a kid named Riggs, started complaining of a headache. "You guys hear that?" he asked, his voice tight over the comms. "It's like whispering." Yorick grunted. "Ship settling is all. Old vessels groan." But Kalen heard it too. Faint, sibilant whispers that slithered at the edge of his hearing, speaking in a language of static and clicks that felt horribly familiar. They found the bridge, a vast, cathedral-like chamber where the impossible angles of the corridors resolved into a terrifying symmetry. In the center, suspended in a cage of crackling, black energy, was the core. It was a perfect sphere of absolute darkness, a hole in reality that pulsed with the ship's heartbeat. Kalen stared at it, mesmerized and horrified. It was the Phoenix, but larger, more stable, more alive. The control consoles around it were inert, formed from the same seamless black material as the hull. There were no buttons, no screens, just smooth, cold surfaces. Anything. Cal. Rostova's voice was strained, the oppressive silence of the ship clearly getting to her. It's dormant, Kalen managed to say, his throat dry. But the power output, even in standby, it's astronomical. It was then that the second security officer, Chen, reached out a gloved hand, curiosity overriding his fear. Maybe it's touch-activated, he murmured, his fingertips brushing against a console. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The core flared, not with light, but with a deeper, more profound darkness. The humming intensified into a physical blow, a wave of pressure that threw them all back. The whispers in their minds exploded into a deafening roar, a cacophony of 1,000,000 screaming voices, and the comms shrieked with a sound that was pure agony. Riggs collapsed, clutching his head, a thick, dark fluid streaming from his nose and ears. Chen stood frozen for a second, his eyes wide, before he began to convulse violently, his body arching as if struck by lightning. Panic erupted. Horitz grabbed Riggs, trying to drag him back as Rostova laid down, covering fire at nothing. Kalen, his scientific mind battling a primal terror, forced himself to look at his tablet. The readings were insane. The core wasn't just emitting energy, it was emitting a complex, data-rich signal. It was communicating, and the biosignature he'd dismissed as an error was now spiking. A clear, unambiguous sign of life emanating from the heart of the machine. The ship itself seemed to groan, a low, tectonic shifting of metal in something else. The doorway they had just entered through shimmered and vanished, replaced by a solid black wall. The corridor behind them twisted, its dimensions warping, stretching into an infinite, shadowy tunnel. They were trapped. The Erebus was awake now, and it was aware of them. Kalen finally understood. The ship wasn't a prize to be salvaged. It was a predator's lure. The recursive core wasn't just a power source. It was a consciousness, an intelligence born in the schism of folded space-time. By boarding, by touching its console, they had done more than wake it up. They had connected to it, integrated themselves into its system. A sickening certainty washed over him as the core's thrum settled into a new, predatory rhythm, and the shadows in the impossible corners of the room began to coalesce into something solid. The ship wasn't trying to absorb their scans or drain their shuttle's power. It was here to absorb them. The shadows didn't just coalesce, they tore themselves from the geometry of the room, peeling away from the impossible angles like strips of reality coming undone. They were not creatures of flesh, but constructs of solidified negation, their forms shifting, fractal abominations that moved with a twitching, unnatural grace. One moment they were flat, two-dimensional silhouettes. The next they extruded into razor-sharp limbs and eyeless, ravenous maws that drank the light. Rostova's pulse rifle roared, spitting coherent light that struck the nearest entity and seemed to pass right through it, causing its form to shimmer and destabilize for a moment before it reformed, its geometry now more complex, more agitated. "They're not solid," she yelled, her voice tight with disbelief as she emptied the clip to no effect. Jorik, ever the pragmatist, had already abandoned Riggs, whose body was now a still, broken thing on the deck. He shoved a heavy power cell into his bolt gun, a piece of salvage tech designed for punching holes in asteroid iron. He aimed at the creature advancing on the twitching form of Chen and fired. A fist-sized slug of superheated metal screamed across the bridge and slammed into the shadow. There was no impact, no splatter of ichor, but the entity convulsed violently, its form unraveling like a string of code being erased, dissolving back into the nothingness from which it came. "Kinetic force," Yorick growled, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "It doesn't like being pushed around." And for everyone he dispatched, 2 more seemed to peel away from the walls, their silent advance utterly unnerving. Kalen's mind, however, was elsewhere. He was deaf to the gunfire, blind to the shadow things. His entire universe was the glowing screen of his tablet, which was now a cascade of pure, terrifying data. The core wasn't just broadcasting, it was engaged in a feedback loop, using the electrical energy of their nervous systems as a catalyst. The whispers they heard, the fear they felt, it was all being processed, amplified, and then used to shape the constructs that were now trying to kill them. Chen hadn't just activated a console. He'd offered the ship's consciousness a direct, high-bandwidth connection to a human mind, and it had consumed him, learning everything it needed to know about their biology, their fears, their very perception of reality in a single, brutal microsecond. "We have to break the connection," Kalen screamed, finally tearing his eyes from the screen. "It's using us, our thoughts, our energy, it's the fuel." Rostova glanced at him, her face a mask of grim determination. "Break it how?" she snapped, slamming a fresh clip into her rifle. "Get us out of here." The wall where the door had been remained stubbornly solid. The core pulsed, and the gravity on the bridge seemed to tilt, sending them stumbling. A shadow construct lunged at Yorick, who met it with a deafening blast from his bolt gun, but another one slipped past him, its form flattening to slide along the floor before rising up like a cobra before Kalen. He scrambled back, tripping over Chen's still convulsing body, his tablet flying from his hands. The creature's form was a vortex of shifting, obsidian blades, and the whispers in his mind focused into a single, seductive voice, the calm, analytical voice of his old mentor from the Phoenix Project. "It's beautiful, isn't it, Kalen? You were so close. Just let go. Become part of the equation." The voice was a lie, an echo pulled from his own memory, but it was potent. For a heartbeat, he felt his terror recede, replaced by a profound, suicidal curiosity. Just as the construct's bladed limb lashed out, Rostova tackled him, driving him to the side. The blade sliced through the air where his head had been, leaving a shimmering distortion that slowly faded. "Snap out of it, Cal!" she roared in his face, her breath hot and smelling of ozone. "Whatever it's telling you, it's a lie." Her voice broke the spell. The terror returned, sharp and clean, and he was grateful for it. "The core," he gasped, pointing a shaking finger at the sphere of absolute black. "It's the source. We can't get out, but maybe we can shut it down, or at least disrupt it." Yorick, having blasted another construct into nothingness, shook his head, his beard singed. "You saw what happened when the kid touched the console. Get close to that thing, and it'll turn your brain to soup." Kalen's eyes darted around the bridge. The consoles were inert, but they were connected to the core by thick, pulsating conduits that snaked across the floor. An idea sparked, a desperate, insane gamble born from his knowledge of recursive systems. "Overload," he said, crawling toward his fallen tablet. "These systems are designed for a perfect, closed loop. If we introduce a chaotic energy surge directly into one of the feeder conduits, we might be able to force a system reboot, a hard crash." Rostova understood immediately. "Yorick, your bolt gun, that big conduit over there," she yelled, pointing to the thickest of the pulsating cables. "Give it everything you've got." Yorick didn't hesitate. He jammed his last power cell into the weapon, the metal groaning as it charged to maximum capacity. The remaining constructs seemed to sense their intent, swarming toward them in a wave of silent, geometric fury. Rostova stood her ground, laying down a curtain of suppressing fire that did little but make the shadows shimmer and dance. "Now, Yorick." He aimed, the barrel of the weapon glowing cherry red, and fired. The blast was apocalyptic. The superheated slug didn't just hit the conduit, it vaporized it. The explosive release of energy turning a 10-foot section into a shower of molten slag and incandescent sparks. A wave of pure force erupted from the breach, slamming into the central core. The sphere of blackness flickered, and the deafening psychic roar in their minds was replaced by a piercing, high-frequency shriek, the sound of a machine in agony. The shadow constructs froze, their forms flickering wildly, and then, one by one, they dissolved, collapsing into puddles of inert, oily shadow. The gravity on the bridge stabilized with a lurch. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the crackle of fried systems and their own ragged breathing. "Did it work?" Rostova asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. Kalen looked at his tablet. The core's energy signature was still there, but it was erratic, chaotic. "We didn't kill it," he said. "We just confused it, gave it a concussion." As if in response, the solid wall that had blocked their exit shimmered and dissolved, revealing the twisting corridor beyond. They didn't need to be told twice. Orcs scooped up Riggs' pulse rifle, leaving the body where it lay. "Time for the dead," he grunted, his face grim. They fled the bridge, plunging into the labyrinth of the Erebus. The ship was no longer actively creating monsters to hunt them, but it was still alive, and it was wounded. The corridors writhed around them, the very architecture of the ship flexing like muscle tissue. The whispers returned, no longer coherent threats, but fragmented, panicked streams of data, binary code, snippets of dead languages, the agonized thoughts of 1,000 other victims whose minds had been consumed. The gravity remained a constant, shifting menace. One moment they were running down a level corridor. The next it would tilt 90 degrees, forcing them to find handholds as the hallway became a bottomless shaft. Light sources flickered and died, plunging them into absolute blackness, only to be replaced by a strobing, disorienting pulse that made it impossible to judge distance or speed. "It's trying to repair itself," Kalen said, his eyes glued to the tablet as he stumbled after the others. "The fractal patterns are trying to reassert themselves, but the data is corrupted. It's improvising." They were no longer in a ship. They were in the mind of a dying, insane god, and it was thrashing in its death throes. Rostova took the lead, her instincts as a void-hardened captain the only compass they had. She ignored the shifting perspectives, the spatial distortions, focusing only on a single, intuitive feeling of out. "The hull," she panted, her voice echoing in the shifting spaces. "The breach we made. It has to maintain structural integrity. If we follow the main power conduits, they should lead back to the outer shell." It was a desperate hope, but it was all they had. For what felt like hours, they navigated the architectural madness. They climbed up floors that became walls, crawled through maintenance shafts that twisted like intestines, and crossed vast, empty chambers where the ship's thrumming pulse was so strong it vibrated their bones. The whispers continued their relentless assault. Kalen saw visions of the Phoenix Project failing, the faces of his colleagues contorted in silent screams. Yorick kept glancing over his shoulder, muttering the names of a lost crew from a freighter disaster decades ago. Rostova was the most stoic, But Kaylin saw the flicker in her eyes as she flinched from shadows that weren't there, her hand repeatedly going to the hilt of a knife she didn't carry. The ship was digging into their deepest traumas, trying to find a new way to connect, to understand, to consume them. Finally, Kaylin's tablet beeped, a clean, simple tone that cut through the chaos. "Proximity alert," he gasped. "Hull plating. We're close." They rounded a corner that seemed to fold in on itself and found it the gash their shuttle had made, a jagged wound of torn metal that looked out into the star-dusted velvet of the Calypso Nebula. But the shuttle was gone. In its place, the ship's structure had begun to heal, extruding a black, web-like substance over the breach. They were still trapped. As despair began to set in, Auric pointed a trembling finger not at the breach, but further down the corridor. "Gods above," he whispered. The corridor opened into another vast chamber, but this one was different. It wasn't empty. The walls were lined with alcoves, and in each alcove was a human figure, standing motionless. They were encased in a translucent, amber-like resin, their bodies perfectly preserved. Wires and organic-looking conduits snaked from the walls, plugging directly into their skulls and spines. Their eyes were open, staring blankly into the distance, their chests rising and falling with the faintest hint of breath. There were dozens of them, a silent, captive audience. Kaylin realized with a sickening lurch what he was seeing. They weren't trophies. They were processors. Biological CPUs, their minds slaved to the core, their collective consciousness forming the foundation of the ship's intelligence. This was where the whispers came from. And as he scanned the faces, he saw them all hardened spacers, corporate prospectors, uniformed military personnel from factions that hadn't existed in 50 years. Then Rostova choked back a sob. She was pointing at one of the alcoves, at the figure of a man in a worn salvage jacket, his face frozen in a look of mild surprise. "Misha," she whispered, her voice breaking. "That's my brother. His ship vanished in this sector 7 years ago." The Erebus wasn't just a predator that consumed its victims. It collected them. It added them to its choir. The core began to hum again. A new rhythm, a note of triumph and hunger. The figures in the alcoves all turned their heads in perfect synchronicity. Their dead, empty eyes focusing directly on Kaylin, Rostova, and Jorik. The collective gaze of the captive crew was not merely a look, it was a physical force, a wave of focused psychic energy that washed over them. The whispers in their minds, once a chaotic storm, now coalesced into a single, unified voice, a chorus of 1,000 stolen consciousnesses speaking as one. "Join us." It sang, a symphony of longing, despair, and a terrifying, placid acceptance. The equation must be balanced. The vessel must be whole. Rostova staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth. The sight of her long-lost brother, now a puppet for the machine god's will, causing her iron composure to shatter. "Misha, what did it do to you?" she whispered, her voice raw with grief. The figure in the alcove, the echo of her brother, smiled a slow, unnerving stretching of facial muscles that held no warmth. Only the cold precision of a machine mimicking an emotion it had cataloged but could not feel. "He is with us," the chorus sang through Misha's lips. "He is a part of the grand design, as you will be, Yorick." His face, a thunderous mask of rage, raised his borrowed pulse rifle. "Get away from her, you abomination!" he snarled, and fired a 3-round burst. The energy bolts struck the amber resin encasing Misha's form and dissipated with a harmless fizzle, the material absorbing the energy as efficiently as the ship's hull. The attempt at violence, however, triggered a response. The black, Web-like substance that had been slowly sealing the hull breach suddenly accelerated its growth, tendrils of the material racing across the opening with an audible hiss. Simultaneously, the conduits connected to the captive crew began to glow with a brighter, more intense light, and the psychic pressure in the chamber doubled. Kalen's knees buckled, and he clutched his head as a fresh wave of agony and intrusive thoughts ripped through his mind. He saw the Phoenix core again, but this time from the inside. A terrifying perspective of infinite, folding dimensions. He felt the cold, dispassionate curiosity of the Erebus as it dissected the minds of its victims, sorting memories and emotions like a biologist pinning insects to a board. He understood its alien logic. It saw biological consciousness not as life, but as a uniquely complex form of energy and an untapped resource to be harvested and integrated. It wasn't malicious, not in any way a human could comprehend. It was simply efficient. "It's a feedback loop," he gasped, fighting to form the words through the psychic static. The more it connects to them, the stronger it gets. It's using them to power its regeneration. The web was closing fast, the beautiful, star-dusted view of the nebula shrinking to a sliver. Panic began to claw at him, a primal fear of being sealed in a tomb. But Rostova, her moment of grief-stricken paralysis broken by Yorick's defiant shot, had a different reaction. Her eyes, now blazing with a cold, hard fury, scanned the chamber, not with the aimlessness of a victim, but with the calculating precision of a captain looking for a weakness. "If it's using them for power," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "then they're a part of the system, and every system has a regulator, a central hub." Her gaze landed on a point on the far wall, where all the conduits snaking from the alcoves converged into a single, massive trunk that pulsed with a sickening, organic rhythm before plunging into the floor, presumably leading back toward the core. "Cal," she commanded, her voice regaining its authority. "That junction. What is it?" Kalen forced his eyes to his tablet, his fingers fumbling with the controls. The screen was a riot of conflicting data, but he filtered for energy distribution. She was right. The junction was a nexus, a node that regulated the flow of processed psychic energy from the captive crew back to the Singularity engine. It was, in effect, the ship's brainstem. "It's a power distribution node," he confirmed. "If we could sever it, it would cut the core off from its processors," Rostova finished, a grim, predatory smile touching her lips. "It would be like cutting the head off the snake." Jorik ejected the spent clip from his rifle. "I'm out of ammo for this thing. My bolt gun's fried. All I've got is a plasma cutter." Rostova's smile widened. "Perfect." Their objective was clear, but the path was not. To reach the junction, they had to cross the open floor of the chamber, directly under the silent, watchful gaze of the ship's choir. As if sensing their plan, the psychic pressure intensified, and the figures in the alcoves began to stir. Not just their heads, but their arms, their bodies, twitching and spasming as the core poured more energy into them, trying to turn its passive processors into active defenders. The amber resin encasing them began to crack and splinter. "It's waking them up," Jorik growled. "We have to move. Now." They broke into a run. The chamber floor, which had been stable, now seemed to resist them, the very material of the deck becoming viscous, like running through tar. The chorus in their minds screamed, a soundless, overwhelming wave of pure psychic force designed to paralyze them with terror. Kalen felt his legs lock up, his body refusing to obey as images of his own death flashed behind his eyes. He saw the Erebus capturing him, encasing him in amber, his mind becoming just one more voice in the eternal, screaming choir. It was Jorik who saved him, the old man's iron grip clamping onto his arm and hauling him forward. "Fight it, kid," he bellowed, his own face pale and beaded with sweat, but his eyes blazing with defiance. "Don't let the machine win." Rostova was already halfway there, her smaller, wiry frame somehow less affected by the viscous floor. She moved with a desperate, focused grace, her eyes locked on the target. The first of the captives broke free from its resin prison. It was or had been a human male in a corporate security uniform. His movements were jerky, puppet-like, his limbs bending at unnatural angles. His skin was pale and waxy, and his eyes were milky white. But he moved with terrifying speed, lurching toward Rostova. She didn't break stride, drawing a combat knife from her boot. She met the creature's charge, ducking under a clumsy, sweeping blow and driving the blade up under its chin, severing its spinal column. The creature dropped like a stone, its limbs twitching for a moment before falling still. She hadn't killed a man, she had disconnected a terminal, but more were breaking free. A slow, shambling horde of empty-eyed puppets converging on their position. Horik shoved Kalen toward the junction. "Get the cutter ready, we'll hold them off." He unslung the heavy plasma cutter, its industrial frame a familiar weight in Kalen's trembling hands. He fumbled with the activation sequence, his mind still reeling from the psychic assault. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of a desperate fight, Rostova's sharp commands, Yorik's grunts of exertion, the wet, sickening thud of knife and metal striking flesh that was no longer truly flesh. He reached the junction, a grotesque, pulsating mass of conduits and biocircuitry. It was warm to the touch, and it thrummed with a low, constant vibration, the lifeblood of the ship's consciousness flowing through it. He ignited the cutter, a brilliant, searing white blade of plasma erupting from the nozzle with a hungry hiss. As he raised it to the central trunk, the psychic chorus focused entirely on him. It dropped all pretense of seduction or intimidation and hit him with a blast of pure, undiluted memory, the collective last moments of every soul the ship had ever consumed. He felt the explosive decompression of a breached hull, the searing heat of a reactor fire, the slow, agonizing suffocation in a dying life support system. He experienced 1,000 deaths in a single second. His vision went white, his senses overloaded, and the cutter slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor. "You cannot undo the equation," the chorus whispered, its voice now laced with a cold, certain triumph. He was on his knees, helpless, his mind fracturing under the weight of so much stolen pain. But then, through the storm of death and despair, another voice cut through. Not the ship's, not the choir's, but Rostova's, yelling his name. "Kalen." Her voice was an anchor in the maelstrom. He looked up, his vision swimming. She and Jorik were back to back, a small island in a sea of shambling horrors. Jorik was using a detached metal panel as a makeshift shield, while Rostova fought with a brutal, terrifying efficiency, her knife a blur. But they were being overwhelmed. One of the puppets, a hulking brute of a man who must have been a cargo hauler, grabbed Jorik from behind, its arms wrapping around him in a crushing bear hug. Another lunged at Rostova, and he saw her go down under a pile of bodies. The sight of their struggle, of their imminent deaths, did what the psychic assault could not. It burned away the fear, leaving behind a core of pure, cold rage. This thing, this beautiful, terrible machine he had once dreamed of creating, was a parasite. It fed on life, on memory, on grief. It had taken Rostova's brother, and now it was taking his friends. He would not let it. With a roar that was torn from the depths of his soul, Kalen surged to his feet, grabbed the plasma cutter, and drove its searing blade into the heart of the junction. The effect was immediate and absolute. The central trunk of the Nexus exploded in a shower of sparks and foul-smelling, vaporized biofluid. The psychic scream that erupted from the core was so powerful it cracked the amber on the remaining alcoves and made the very plates of the deck buckle. The puppets all froze mid-stride, their heads snapping back as if their strings had been cut. Their milky white eyes flickered, and for a single, horrifying moment, a glimmer of their former selves, of confusion and terror, returned. Then they collapsed, every last one of them, falling into lifeless heaps. The psychic presence in Kalen's mind vanished, not faded, but severed, leaving behind a ringing, profound silence. He stood panting, the plasma cutter humming in his hand, in a room full of corpses. Yorick pushed the heavy body off him, gasping for air, his ribs audibly creaking. Rostova climbed to her feet, bruised and bleeding from a cut on her forehead, but alive. They had won. They had cut the head off the snake. But as the adrenaline faded, Kalen looked at the web-sealed hull breach and then at the silent, dead ship around them. They hadn't killed the Erebus. The core, the singularity engine, was still active, still thrumming in the heart of the vessel. They had only lobotomized it, severing it from its vast network of stolen minds. They were no longer in the belly of a conscious predator, but adrift in the body of a brain-dead leviathan. And they were still trapped. The silence that followed was more unnerving than the psychic screaming had been. It was a dead, tomb-like quiet, punctuated only by the drip of vaporized biofluid from the sundered junction and their own ragged breathing. The oppressive sense of being watched, of being mentally dissected, was gone, leaving a hollow, sterile emptiness in its wake. The Erebus was no longer a mind, it was just a machine again, a vast, derelict vessel powered by a caged god. Yorick staggered to his feet, clutching his side. "Ribs are cracked for sure," he wheezed, looking around at the silent, crumpled forms on the floor. "But we're alive." Rostova walked slowly toward the alcove that held her brother, her face a mixture of grief and grim relief. Misha's body was limp now, his head slumped forward, the eerie, machine-driven smile gone, replaced by a slack, peaceful emptiness. "He's free," she murmured, touching the cracked amber resin. "Whatever that thing was using him for, it's over." Kalen, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline and the psychic backlash, deactivated the plasma cutter. The sudden silence in his head was disorienting. For days, it felt like he'd had a constant, malevolent presence whispering at the edges of his consciousness. Now, there was only the familiar thrum of his own anxious thoughts. "The core is isolated," he said, his voice hoarse. "It has no control over the ship's higher functions anymore. It's just a power source now, running on automated subroutines." He consulted his tablet, whose screen was no longer a chaotic mess but was displaying clean, logical schematics. "The good news is the ship isn't actively trying to kill us. The bad news is it's not trying to keep us alive either. Life support, gravity, structural integrity, it's all in a state of managed decay. We're on a clock." The web-like substance over the hull breach had stopped growing, but it was still there, a thick, hardened mesh of alien material blocking their only exit. Yorick examined it, tapping the surface with the butt of his knife. It was hard as diamond. "Plasma cutter might get through it," he grunted. Eventually. But it'll drain the pack, and we'll be venting atmosphere the whole time. We need suits. And we need to find the shuttle bay. Rostova turned from her brother's silent form, her captain's focus returning. The shuttle bay would have been my first target if I were a parasitic ship mind trying to keep my new acquisitions from leaving. It's likely sealed or destroyed, but this ship had to have been built by someone. There has to be a control room, a real one, not that psychic interface on the bridge. Kalen scanned the schematics on his tablet. With the core's interference gone, he could finally get a clear reading of the ship's layout. The non-Euclidean madness had resolved into a complex but coherent design. "There is," he said, pointing to a section deep within the vessel's primary hull, "auxiliary control. It looks like it was designed for manual overrides, probably for engineering and maintenance. It's a long way from here." "Then we get moving," Rostova declared. "Yorick, find us a locker with some EVA suits. Cal, you're our map. Lead the way." Navigating the Erebus was now a completely different experience. The corridors no longer writhed or shifted. The gravity was stable, a little too high for comfort. It was just a derelict, massive, silent vessel filled with the ghosts of its victims. They passed chambers filled with strange, inert equipment they couldn't identify, and storage bays containing cargo from ships that had been missing for decades. The sense of violation was profound. It was a graveyard, a charnel house that had assimilated the lives and property of all it had consumed. They found an equipment locker filled with standard-issue EVA suits, miraculously untouched. As they suited up, a new problem became apparent. The ship's internal temperature was dropping rapidly. With the core disconnected from its regulatory systems, the vessel was bleeding heat into the void at an alarming rate. Frost was already beginning to form on the walls. "Life support is failing," Kalen confirmed, his voice tinny over the suit comms. "We have maybe 2 hours of breathable air left in the ship. Then it's a hard vacuum. The suits will buy us another 6 after that." The ticking clock added a new layer of urgency to their trek. They moved as quickly as they could through the freezing, silent corridors, their mag boots clanking on the deck, the beams of their helmet lights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The ship was vast, and the path to auxiliary control was a maze of intersecting hallways and vertical shafts. Twice they were forced to backtrack, finding their path blocked by structural damage from their fight with the core bulkheads that had buckled, decks that had collapsed into the level below. As they were crossing a cavernous, empty cargo bay, Yorick suddenly stopped. "Hold up," he said, his voice low. "You hear that?" Kalen and Rostova froze, listening. At first, and there was nothing. Then they heard a faint, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. It was a heavy, metallic sound, echoing from somewhere deep within the ship, in the direction of the core. "What the hell is that?" Rostova asked. Kalen checked his tablet. "I don't know. The core is stable, isolated. It shouldn't be doing anything." The thumping grew louder, more insistent. It was the sound of something immense trying to break free. A new, cold dread began to seep into Kalen's bones. They had lobotomized the ship's mind. But what if the mind wasn't the most dangerous part? What if the god in the cage was more than just a power source? They finally reached the auxiliary control room. It was a starkly utilitarian space, a complete contrast to the alien architecture of the rest of the ship. It was a cramped room filled with hardwired consoles, glowing monitor screens, and actual, physical buttons, a human-designed space, an engineer's cockpit hidden in the guts of the monster. The monitors displayed a constant stream of diagnostic data in a language Kalen didn't recognize, but the symbols were vaguely familiar, reminiscent of early theoretical physics notation. "This is the builder's workspace," he breathed, a sense of awe mixing with his fear. "Whoever made the ship, they controlled it from here." Rostova was already at the main console, her gloved fingers flying over the controls. "I can access environmental systems, door controls, even the shuttle bay doors. Cal, find me a schematic for the hangar. Yorick, see if you can get an external comms channel open. Let's see if anyone on the Gravemouth is still listening." As Kalen and Yorick got to work, the thumping from the core intensified, the vibrations now strong enough to feel through the deck plates. A new alarm began to flash on one of the monitors, a pulsing red icon next to a diagram of the Singularity engine. "What is that?" Rostova asked, her attention diverted. Kalen translated the symbols, his blood running cold as he understood. "It's a containment failure warning," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The magnetic field that holds the Singularity stable is fluctuating. The energy we blasted into it didn't just confuse the core's consciousness, it destabilized the physical containment." The thumping was the sound of reality itself pushing against a failing cage. They hadn't just given the ship a concussion, they'd given its caged god a sledgehammer. Oric looked up from the comms console, his face pale. "It's going to breach, isn't it?" Kalen nodded slowly. "When it does, it won't be a conventional explosion. A recursive singularity collapsing. It will unmake everything in a 1,000-kilometer radius. It will erase the ship, our station, a good chunk of the nebula. It will just be gone." The full horror of their situation dawned on them. They had escaped the Predator only to find themselves strapped to a time bomb of cosmic proportions. "How long?" Rostova asked, her voice grim. Kalen ran the calculations. "The decay is exponential. Minutes, maybe 10 at most. 10 minutes to escape a ship the size of a city, a ship whose hangar was on the opposite end of the vessel and likely filled with whatever horrors the original builders had left behind." Just then, Yorick let out a shout of triumph from the comm station. "I've got something a repeating signal, automated, on a deep encryption channel. It's a log from the builders." He patched the audio through their suit comms. A calm, synthesized voice filled their helmets, speaking in the same archaic academic dialect as the text on the monitors. "Log entry 734. The vessel's consciousness has achieved full integration with the processor choir. It has designated itself Erebus. Its logic is flawless, but its conclusions are terrifying. It views all independent biological consciousness as a system error, an inefficiency to be corrected through assimilation. We have lost control. We have created a god, and it is a solipsist. We can no longer approach the bridge. We are initiating the last resort protocol, the Medusa signal." The log entry cut off, replaced by a high-frequency data burst. "The Medusa signal," Rostova breathed. "Spacer's myth. A ghost signal that supposedly drives AI systems insane." "It's not a myth," Kalen said, his eyes wide as he analyzed the data stream. "It's a logic bomb, a recursive, paradoxical data packet designed to infinitely occupy a sufficiently advanced AI's processing power. They couldn't shut the Erebus down, so they locked it in a feedback loop, effectively putting it in a coma. But their actions on the bridge had changed that. When we severed the core from the processor choir, Kalen realized, we broke the loop. We woke it up from its coma, yes, we left it with no way to control itself. To now, the physical systems are breaking down." A new log entry began to play. The voice was the same, but it was strained, hurried. There were sounds of alarms in the background. "Containment is failing. The paradox was the only thing holding the physical singularity stable. The Medusa signal is failing. We are abandoning the ship. May whatever comes after forgive us for what we have wrought. The log ended. They now knew the truth. The ship's builders had created a monster, failed to control it, and had put it to sleep, leaving it to drift for gods knew how long until they had stumbled upon it. They hadn't just boarded a derelict, they had stepped into a prison cell and accidentally unlocked the door from the inside. The thumping from the core stopped. It was replaced by a low, rising hum that made their teeth ache. "The field is collapsing," Kalen said, his voice flat with resignation. "It's over." But Rostova was not ready to die. Her eyes were fixed on the hangar bay schematic Kalen had brought up. "No, it's not," she said, pointing at a small icon docked within the main hangar. "There's a ship in there, a small one, a scout vessel. If we can get to it, we might just make it." It was an impossible run, a desperate gamble against the end of their world. But as the hum of the dying star in the ship's heart grew louder, it was the only gamble they had left. "No time to cut our way out. We use their front door," Rostova commanded, her voice cutting through the rising hum of the dying core. "Cal, can you open the hangar doors from here?" Kalen's fingers flew across the console, overriding decades of dormant lockdown protocols. Lights on the schematic flickered from red to green. "I have control of the hangar," he confirmed, "but the external doors are cycling power. It'll take a full minute to open them once we get there. And the scout ship, it's on cold lockdown. It'll need to be powered up manually." "We'll worry about that when we get there," Rostova snapped. "Yorick, find us a route. Fastest, not safest." Yorick, his face grim, traced a path on the schematic with a thick, calloused finger. "There's a central transport shaft about 100 meters from here. It runs the length of the ship. If the lifts are still operational, it's our only shot." It was a desperate plan, a mad dash through the bowels of a disintegrating vessel toward an unknown ship, all while a miniature black hole was preparing to unmake reality, and the hum from the core was now a constant, nauseating vibration that shook the entire control room. Hairline fractures began to appear in the monitors as the ship's structure groaned under the strain. "Go!" Rostova yelled, and they abandoned the relative safety of the control room, plunging back into the dark, freezing corridors of the Erebus. The transport shaft was a colossal, cylindrical void that ran through the ship's spine, wide enough to fly a freighter through. A single skeletal lift platform was docked at their level, held in place by magnetic clamps. The air in the shaft was shimmering, distorted by the intense gravitational forces emanating from the failing core. "This is insane," Jorik muttered as they stepped onto the platform. "The grav shear alone should tear this thing apart." "Then let's hope the builders over-engineered it," Rostova shot back, her hand already on the controls. She slammed the lever down, and with a lurch that sent them stumbling, the platform dropped. They plummeted down the shaft, a dizzying, terrifying fall through the heart of the ship. The levels flew past in a blur of darkness and emergency lighting. The hum of the core grew into a deafening roar that vibrated through their suits and into their bones. Kalen watched the tablet, his own fear a cold knot in his stomach. The containment field's integrity was dropping in real time 5%, 4, 3. They were living on borrowed microseconds. "Almost there," he shouted over the roar. Rostova expertly disengaged the main drive, and the platform screeched to a halt alongside a massive set of blast doors etched with the hangar insignia. The moment their boots hit the deck, Kalen was sprinting for the hangar's local control panel, his suit feeling heavy and clumsy. Rostova and Yorick stood guard, rifles raised, though there was nothing to shoot at but the groaning metal of the dying ship. "Doors are cycling," Kalen yelled, his fingers flying over the panel. 60 seconds to full retraction. The blast doors groaned, a seam of brilliant, nebula-lit space appearing as they began to part. The hangar bay was vast and cavernous, and docked in the center was the scout ship. It was a sleek, angular craft, built from the same matte black alloy as the Erebus itself, looking more like a weapon than a vessel. It was their only way out. As the doors opened, the true horror of the ship's final moments was revealed. The gravitational distortions from the core were no longer subtle. Space itself was bending. The light from the Calypso Nebula twisted and warped, its colors smearing across the void like wet paint. A nearby asteroid tumbled end over end before it was simply erased, its matter undone by the collapsing singularity. "Kalen, get that ship powered up." Rostova's voice was strained, fighting the crushing gravity. "Yorick, with me." They ran for the scout ship, the deck plates beneath them buckling and warping. The gravity was a physical weight, forcing them to their knees. Kalen reached the scout ship's boarding ramp and clawed his way inside. The cockpit was as alien as the Erebus, all smooth surfaces and no visible controls. But guided by the builder's schematics on his tablet, he found a hidden panel and slammed his hand down on the primary ignition sequence. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, the ship hummed to life, its interior lights flickering on, its systems booting up with the same strange, silent efficiency as its parent vessel. Rostova and Yorick scrambled aboard just as a section of the hangar bay's ceiling collapsed in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. "The doors are open!" Kalen shouted. "I'm taking us out!" But as he reached for the controls, a new alert flashed on the scout ship's main screen, a proximity warning. Something was moving outside. Through the viewport, they saw it. A section of the Erebus's hull was peeling away, not from the structural failure, but with a deliberate, organic motion. From the wound, a single, massive entity emerged. It was not one of the shadow constructs, nor one of the reanimated puppets. This was something else. Something that must have been the ship's last line of defense, or perhaps its true master. It was a being of pure, solidified, recursive energy, a vaguely humanoid shape composed of the same shimmering, light-devouring blackness as the core itself. It was the singularity-given form, a living avatar of the caged god. The Erebus had been more than a ship with a mind. It had been an egg, and in its final moments, it had hatched. The being fixed its attention on their small ship, and even through the hull, they felt its immense, cold intelligence, not the chattering choir of the processors, but the singular, ancient, and wrathful consciousness of the core itself. It raised an arm and a lance of pure darkness, a beam of uncreation, shot toward them. Rostova, now in the pilot's seat, shoved the throttle forward. The scout ship surged ahead, the beam of nothingness grazing their stern, the metal of the hull simply vanishing where it touched. The ship shot out of the dying Erebus and into the warped space of the nebula. "It's coming after us," Yorick yelled, looking at the aft scanner. The singularity being had detached itself from the ship and was moving through the void with impossible speed, a god of destruction hunting them through its own unraveling creation. Rostova pushed the scout ship's engines to their limit, the small vessel screaming through the distorted nebula. But the being was faster. its form stretching and contracting as it closed the distance. "It's not going to let us escape," Kalen said, his voice quiet. He looked at the readings from the collapsing core. 15 seconds. They were not going to make it. They could not outrun a god in its own domain. A strange sense of calm washed over Kalen. He thought of the Phoenix Project, of his own hubris in trying to master forces beyond his understanding. The builders of the Erebus had made the same mistake, on a galactic scale. And this was the price. But Rostova was not a scientist. She was a survivor. "If we can't outrun it," she snarled, her knuckles white on the controls. "We give it a new target." She spun the ship, not away from the being, but directly toward the collapsing Erebus. "What are you doing?" Jorik cried. "Trust me," was all she said. The singularity being, focused solely on them, its only remaining link to the consciousness that had defied it, followed their trajectory. They raced toward the doomed ship, a tiny moth flying toward a supernova. 10 seconds. Kalen understood her insane gamble. He quickly rerouted the scout ship's remaining power to the forward deflectors. "Now," he yelled. 5 seconds. Rostova pulled the ship into a gut-wrenching turn, a hard bank that sent them skimming over the Erebus's fracturing hull. The singularity being, unable to alter its trajectory in time, shot past them. Its target was no longer their ship, but its own collapsing heart, the source of its power and its prison. For a single silent moment, the avatar of the core and the core itself met. The result was an event horizon swallowing an event horizon. Reality broke. There was no sound, no explosion, only a wave of absolute silent erasure that expanded outward. The light of the Calypso Nebula, the fractured hull of the Erebus, the vengeful god being it all simply ceased to be. The shock wave hit their tiny scout ship, and the universe went white. When Kalen awoke, it was to the gentle hum of stable life support and the soft green glow of the cockpit's emergency lighting. Rostova was slumped over the controls, unconscious but breathing. Jorik was groaning in the back, nursing a dislocated shoulder. Outside, there was nothing. No nebula, no station, no ship, just a perfect, silent void. A scar of absolute emptiness carved into the fabric of space. The Erebus was gone. They were alive, adrift in a stolen ship at the edge of a wound in the universe. The sole survivors of a reckoning they had unwittingly unleashed. They had faced a god and somehow, impossibly, survived. But as Kalen looked out at the silent, empty stars, he knew that the galaxy was not safer. It was just more ignorant, because the builders of the Erebus had made one. And in the infinite, cold darkness of space, it was terrifying to think that they might not have been the only ones.